So let's start with the latest report. What are the key trends you're seeing when it comes to traditional versus renewable energy investments in the MENA region?
In order to look at the energy investments in MENA, it's also good to have a look at the global energy investments. The IEA recently reported a $2.4 trillion investments in the energy sector globally, which constitutes around 2 to 2.5% of the global GDP. While doing our work and calculating the MENA energy investments for the upcoming 5 years, we saw that this percentage in the region is around 6 to 8% of the region's GDP. Well, this is very important because it shows that the region is doing more than the global average when it comes to investing in energy. Now, in our report, we usually track the four different main sectors, gas, oil, power, and petrochemicals. We saw the large increase in gas projects this year with a 5% year-on-year increase, driven by, of course, the increased global demand on gas and huge projects going on in the region, most notably the North Field expansion in Qatar and the Jafurah project in Saudi Arabia. For oil, we saw a 3% year-on-year increase, driven by also big upstream projects in the region, mainly driven by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, given that both countries want to capitalize on the high prices and increase their crude oil output. And of course, UAE targeting a 5 million barrels per day by 2030, and Saudi Arabia 13 million barrels per day. For the power sector, we saw a modest increase of 1% year-on-year, mostly driven by renewables. We usually see that the power sector, the investments in the power sector are around $250 billion for upcoming 5 years, mainly driven by renewable energy projects. And most projects are concentrated on the generation value chain, around 80 to 85%, and 15 to 20% on the transmission and distribution value chains. Now, the largest increase was recorded for the petrochemicals with a 45% year-on-year increase, driven by huge projects in Iraq, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. But most projects in the petrochemical sector are planned projects because in our calculation, we track the committed and planned projects.
So which countries are investing the most in renewables currently, and by how much?
Yeah, if we're talking about the MENA region specifically, well, the two regions mostly active in the renewable space are the GCC and North Africa. When looking at the GCC, we see Saudi Arabia investing a lot for the upcoming 5 years, around $30 billion for the upcoming 5 years in renewables, and around 60 to 65% are committed projects. The UAE also has a huge drive in renewables projects with around $12 billion split between committed and planned investments. When looking at North Africa, the trend that we see there is that most projects are planned projects rather than committed. We see that Morocco is leading the renewables race with around $27 billion for the upcoming 5 years, around 80% as planned projects. Then we have Algeria with around $17 billion, around 95% are planned projects, and Egypt with around $10 billion for the upcoming 5 years, and 60 to 70% are also planned projects. So I would say that these are the key countries with the large investments. Of course, not to forget Jordan, which was able to meet its short-term targets and is on way to meet its long-term targets. However, if we are comparing by the size of the project or the size of the installed capacities, we see that these countries are mainly driving the race.
The report also mentions expected renewables in the MENA region to have around 33 gigawatts by 2026. What do you think, what kind of renewables will most likely lead this increase, and in which countries as well?
Yeah, well, renewables in the region are mostly led by solar PV and onshore wind. Out of the 33 gigawatts, we see 26 gigawatts, around 80%, being led by solar PV projects. And that constitutes utility scale solar PV and distributed solar PV.
Yeah.
Then we see a 20% share for onshore wind, and the rest for other renewable sources such as CSP, geothermal, and non-hydro renewable energy sources. Of course, the countries which are leading this are the countries which are investing the most, basically. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Morocco, Egypt, Algeria, also
Mhm.
Iraq. And in the Levant region, we see Iraq having a lot of planned projects, but it is very prospective.
Yes.
Also Jordan. Lebanon has a high prospectivity, but everything is in the planning phase.
The data also on planned projects until 2026 shows an almost even split between oil, gas, power, and petrochemical projects. It gives petrochemicals project, though, a much larger share than 9% of committed projects. Why is that?
More committed, 9% committed. Yeah, as I said
Yes.
before, although petrochemicals are recording the highest increase, around 45% year on year, but most projects are being driven by the plant, being in the plant phase that is pre-FID. And the reason behind that is historically over the past, since the the before last, if you want, oil crash in 2015 and the low oil prices, we saw a drop in investments in the upstream sector in general. And usually that cascades into a drop in investments in petrochemicals. Now, given the latest crash in prices due to COVID, and the world basically waking up to the reality that we will need oil and gas for decades to come, and due to the historical lack of investments over the past few years, there is a wake-up call that we need investments in upstream, and that automatically cascades into investments in petrochemicals. But you know,
Yes.
these types of investments usually take time. They are cyclic investments,
Mhm.
and they take time to realize. That's why we saw this surge in planning petrochemical projects, because we will need this capacity in the coming few years.
The report also notes that 80% of renewable capacity is to be added by 2026, will come from solar projects. So what compromises the other 20% of the
Yeah.
renewable capacity?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, 80% solar PV, utility scale. Actually, utility scale solar PV constitutes 58% of the total additions,
Mhm.
uh, with 20% for distributed solar PV, then 20% for onshore wind projects, and the rest other non-hydro renewable energy sources such as CSP, geothermal, and other sources. So the prospectivity of the region when it comes to solar energy and wind energy, it shows that these two basically energy, primary energy, constitute around 95% of renewables additions for the upcoming 5 years.
What factors are contributing to the solar red renewable energy mix?
Yes, there are several factors which are driving the focus on solar PV projects in the region, most notably the prospectivity of the region. You know, in the MENA, whether GCC, Levant, or North Africa, we are located in one of the most highly prospective regions when it comes to solar energy, and the levels of solar irradiation can reach up to 2,400 kilowatt hour per square meter, which is very high compared to other regions globally. So
Yes.
that's number one, the prospectivity of the region and the availability of this energy that only needs to be harnessed using our technologies.
Yes.
Second, I would say, is the huge areas of land which are available also in the GCC, North Africa, and Levant. And this is a major competitive advantage when comparing to Europe, for example. Because if we're talking about a 1.5 gigawatt, let's say, solar PV plant, that takes a huge amount of land. And it has to be somehow far from populated or urban areas. This is a
Mhm.
competitive advantage that we have that maybe in Europe they lack. The
Yes.
third important factor is basically scalability. of the technology due to low prices. Over the past few years, we saw record low prices reaching 1 cent per kilowatt hour, basically, which
Mhm.
shows that the scalability of this technology in the region is technically feasible. And even at that prices, developers are still maintaining a certain return on their investments.
Yes.
The fourth factor is the role of the private investors, basically. Over the past 10 years and the creation of the public-private partnership, the IPP modality, signing power purchase agreements, long-term power purchase agreements, this gave a certain umbrella for the private investor to work on. And we saw the flow of the private investments, especially to the renewable energy sector and solar PV,
Yes.
and especially that the markets are the power markets in MENA are usually follow the single buyer model,
Mhm.
but the generation side of the value chain was to a certain degree unbundled and was awarded to the private sector
Right.
to be able to produce that type of energy and sell it to the off-taker, which is usually a state-owned entity. The final point is the relative stability in the regulatory and the policy framework and the power markets in the region, which
Yes.
usually de-risks investments, especially for the private sector.
What kind of technologies would countries need to invest in or to focus on more to produce more green and hydrogen in the MENA region?
Yes, this is gonna be a bit of a long answer because
Sure.
hydrogen has been taking a lot of hype recently, and if we are talking about technologies related to producing hydrogen, we need to talk about technologies associated with the generation side, with the
Yes.
conversion side, with the transportation, with the storage, with the distribution. So there are a lot of technologies associated with producing hydrogen, whether we are talking the green hydrogen molecule or the blue hydrogen molecule.
Mhm.
Talking about the generation side, if we are talking about green hydrogen, as you know, green hydrogen is produced from water by splitting water into the hydrogen and the oxygen molecules by electrolysis. And usually, if the electrolysis process is powered by renewable energy sources such as solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, it is termed as green hydrogen. Therefore, the first technology that we need to focus on is electrolyzers and the different types of electrolyzers that need to be scaled up if we are targeting these huge volumes of hydrogen production in the future. As you know, we have the alkaline electrolyzers, we have the PEM electrolyzers, solid oxide electrolyzers. So a lot of R&D going into that space. Now for the blue hydrogen, which is very prospective in the region, actually blue hydrogen is a gray hydrogen, which is produced from natural gas by reforming steam, reforming methane. But
Mhm.
the CO2, which is emitted throughout the process, is captured, reused, stored, or sold off as feedstock for the petrochemical and the refining industry. And most demand or consumption in the region is based on gray hydrogen.
Mhm.
And the technology that needs to be utilized and scaled up is the CCUS technology, which is capture, store, utilize, and reuse CO2. So that's another technology that we need to look at.
Mhm.
In addition to that, of course, we need to look at the storage technologies associated with hydrogen, since it is a very light molecule and a very corrosive molecule and very flammable molecule as well. So several considerations need to be taken into consideration. Also, the transportation of hydrogen and whether we are distributing hydrogen in the form of ammonia. So here you need conversion technologies to mix it with nitrogen. If we are liquefying hydrogen, because hydrogen needs incredibly low temperatures to be liquefied and be transported around minus 260 degrees Celsius. So the
Yes.
technology associated with that will also be of focus. And if we are transporting the hydrogen gas via pipelines, as I said, hydrogen is highly corrosive and the existing pipelines cannot be used. So we need a new infrastructure, a new set of pipelines for transporting hydrogen.
Right.
So a lot of technologies are associated with the hydrogen value chain, but I would say that the focus right now is on the generation side, on electrolyzers, on the CCUS technology. And a little bit of focus on the transportation side, that is the ammonia shipments or liquefaction of hydrogen. So yes, I would say that these are the key technologies that we need to focus on.
For our last question today, will the MENA region witness more pink hydrogen and nuclear projects in the future?
That's an interesting question because if we look at the share of nuclear energy in the MENA's energy mix, we see that it doesn't exceed 4 to 5% of the total MENA's energy mix, mainly driven by the UAE and the nuclear power plant, the 5.4 gigawatt nuclear power plant. 3 units are already commissioned and operational, and there's a fourth unit and the final unit on the way. So, of course, given the intermittency of renewable energy sources, and we cannot solely depend on only renewable energy, since we do not have energy storage solutions to date, nuclear and fossil fuels will be indispensable in our power mix. But the addition of nuclear in the MENA's energy mix has several challenges, had several considerations. Most notably, it is a very capital-intensive technology. It is so far they are trying to transform it into being a modular technology by the SMR technology. There are security considerations, there are environmental considerations, waste disposal, also social acceptance of that technology within a certain country, geopolitical considerations. So a lot of factors will play in.
Yes.
But I would say that the UAE is well poised, and they already expressed their interest and their planning to produce hydrogen, basically pink hydrogen. Basically,
Yes.
pink hydrogen is very similar to green hydrogen, but the electrolyzers are powered up by nuclear power instead of renewable power. So, and both of them have zero to very low carbon footprint. Hence, I believe that UAE will be well poised for the short term to produce pink hydrogen molecules. In the future, I would say the other country well poised is Egypt. And Egypt, they have a plan for a nuclear power plant, Al Dab'a nuclear power plant, 4.8 gigawatts to be operational by the end of the decade. If that goes through, I would say that Egypt will also be well positioned to produce a pink hydrogen molecule.
Great, great. Thank you so much for this informative session. And if there's anything else that you would like to add, please do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, on a year-on-year basis, we always publish our MENA energy investment outlook, and we track the upcoming 5 years in energy investments, and we compare with our previous outlook. I would say that, as I said, the region is investing heavily in different energy sources. It is balancing out its energy transition path with the energy security path by investing in all energy vectors. We can't just focus on a single energy vector to drive the energy transition. We will need all different energy vectors going forward. And I think that the region is doing that very well when it comes to investing in fossil fuels while decarbonizing the sector in general, by investing in petrochemicals, because we will need petrochemicals for decades to come, by investing heavily in renewables, by investing in hydrogen. So I believe that the region, especially the GCC and North Africa, are serving a role model, if you want, for other global regions of how charting an energy transition path should look like.
Great, amazing. Thank you so much again for your time, Suhail.
Thank you.